January 1943. Night on the mid. A slow westbound convoy pushes into a weather front rolling down from Greenland. The sea is the color of iron, and every crest breaks into freezing spray that sweeps across the decks. Merchantmen hold their stations in blacked-out columns, their navigation lamps hooded, their engines laboring against the swell. Only the escorts show movement. Small silhouettes, rising hard into the wind, their funnels glowing faintly as they weave across the convoy's flanks. Inside one of those escorts, a British destroyer, hardened by 4 years of ocean escort duty. The wireless office glows red. The air smells of warm valves and damp clothing. A rating in a heavy jumper leans close to his headphones, pencil poised above a signals pad. There is no conversation, only the steady hiss of static. Then it appears. A brief, compressed burst of Morse on a high-frequency band, too short for content, long enough for purpose. A U-boat transmission. The rating notes the frequency, swings the direction-finding loop, and watches the needles settle, one bearing hastily plotted on a chart above him. A small line in a vast ocean. Yet this simple act repeated across countless convoys will help outmaneuver Wolfpack, and the sailor who made it will never be named. By the winter of 1942-43, the Battle of the Atlantic had become the longest and most unforgiving campaign Britain had ever faced. The war in North Africa was turning. The struggle in Russia had entered a brutal new phase, and the skies over Europe filled each night with the roots of RAF bombers. Yet none of it would matter if Britain starved. Every weapon, every gallon of fuel, every loaf of bread depended on the narrow ribbon of sea stretching from North America to the British Isles. At its broadest, the Atlantic is more than 2,000 miles wide. In war, it felt even larger. When the conflict began in September 1939, the Admiralty had immediately placed the merchant navy under disciplined control. Convoys formed within hours of the declaration of war. The logic was ancient. Ships were safer in groups than alone. But the modern threat was new. Germany's U-boats did not rely on chance. They hunted by radio, operating in coordinated groups directed from shore. What began as solitary attacks soon evolved into the Rudel, the Wolfpack, a line of submarines spread across expected convoy routes, ready to converge on a sighted target. For Britain, these early encounters were deeply sobering. A single U-boat could, and did, tear open an entire column of merchant ships in a night. Early Admiralty reports, preserved now in London and Liverpool, show the stark arithmetic. Torpedoes fired at shipping lanes where no aircraft could reach, in waters where escort vessels were too few. Even so, the convoy system held. Merchant ships gathered at Halifax, Sydney, Reykjavik, and the Clyde, forming long, slow columns marked by a Commodore's flagship at the head. Each convoy carried its own tiny community. Deck officers reading Admiralty routing orders by lamplight. Engine room crews coaxing unreliable machinery through storms. Naval signalmen on the Commodore's ship passing instructions by semaphore where wireless silence was enforced. Convoy discipline became a form of collective survival. To fall behind was often to vanish. But the early war escorts had limits. The Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy mustered destroyers, sloops and newly built corvettes, earnest, sturdy little ships crewed by regulars and naval reservists. Their primary sensor was ASDIC, an underwater sound-ranging device that could detect submerged U-boats directly ahead. Yet ASDIC struggled in heavy seas, failed entirely against surface-running submarines, and offered no reach beyond a few hundred yards. At night, especially in the long winter darkness, U-boats could attack on the surface with impunity, slipping between columns and firing torpedoes at close range. On land, Churchill followed the figures with increasing anxiety. His war cabinet briefs from 1940 and 1941 contained plain, clipped warnings. Britain must not fall below a minimum tonnage of imported food and fuel. 1 month of bad sinkings could be endured. 2 could bring the nation to the edge of crisis. The Admiralty estimated that it needed to keep monthly shipping losses below a threshold that was, at times, depressingly narrow. The German side adapted to. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, refined the Wolfpack system into a precise instrument. U-boats were ordered to maintain radio discipline, breaking silence only when reporting a convoy sighting or requesting guidance. These reports, encrypted by Naval Enigma, flowed through the German command network at Kurneval and other coastal stations. The transmissions were short, often under 20 seconds, and designed to reveal nothing beyond essential information. But even these brief signals, invisible to the eye and unreadable in content, carried risk. Radio waves betrayed direction. At this stage of the war, however, that vulnerability had not yet been fully exploited. Britain had begun experimenting with high-frequency direction, finding HFTF or Huffduff in the sailors' shorthand, but installations were limited. Early sets stood ashore, watching wide areas of ocean from fixed stations. A handful of escorts carried prototype or first-generation HFDF systems, but effectiveness varied with sea state operator skill and equipment calibration. What mattered most was time. A single misjudged bearing could allow a Wolfpack to tighten its noose around a convoy undetected. Still, the beginnings of a new pattern were emerging. When a U-boat sent a contact report, 1 or 2 escorts might take a bearing, When a second vessel picked up a similar signal, the two lines could be plotted on a chart. Triangulation, the art of turning radio direction into approximate position, became a new form of weapon. The Admiralty's routing system, previously based on predicted U-boats' patrol lines, now integrated these signals whenever they reached shore. In a sense, the Atlantic was becoming an enormous listening chamber, yet at sea. For the men living among the spray and the cold, the larger intelligence picture remained invisible. What they felt instead was the constant pressure of watchkeeping. Long hours on the bridge, steel decks freezing underfoot, lamps hooded by blackout curtains, and a sea that seemed endless. Every escort, from destroyer to corvette, depended on the accuracy of small, disciplined acts, the tapping of a Morse key, the turn of a direction-finding loop, the careful logging of a signal's bearing. Among the thousands of such acts lay the foundation of something greater, a shifting balance in the war of signals, one that would soon begin to tilt in Britain's favor. And to see how that wider shift came about, we must step further into the evolving architecture of intelligence that shaped the years ahead. By 1941, Britain had begun to assemble a system of intelligence unlike anything seen in naval warfare. At its heart lay a quiet estate in Buckinghamshire, Bletchley Park. Here, under absolute secrecy, cryptanalysts, linguists, mathematicians and wrens worked in shifts around the clock. Their task was formidable: to break successive versions of the German naval enigma, a machine protected not only by mechanical complexity but by strict radio discipline at sea. Early successes came and went. One key might be read for weeks, only to vanish when the Germans changed settings. Yet gradually, through a combination of intercepted traffic, captured codebooks, and painstaking analysis, naval enigma began to yield. The significance of these successes cannot be overstated. When Bletchley Park unlocked a U-boat key, it did not offer clear coordinates or simple orders. Instead, it produced fragments, a patrol line's intended position, a diversionary signal, an instruction for a U-boat to shift west, an order relaxing or tightening radio silence. These fragments were then passed through a small, highly restricted chain, emerging at the Admiralty as special intelligence. Officers receiving these messages rarely knew, and must not ask, how they had been obtained. The information was used, not discussed. Meanwhile, in Liverpool, a new nerve center was forming. The Western Approaches Command, first in Plymouth, then relocated north to escape air raids, brought together the Royal Navy, Roth Coastal Command, and a growing cadre of operational researchers. The building housed large plotting tables, teleprinters, HFDF feeds, and the essential link between convoys at sea and the wider intelligence picture. Wrens moved markers across enormous wall charts that mapped the Atlantic from Greenland to Gibraltar, bearing lines from shore-based HFDF stations. Aircraft position reports and escort signals were layered into a composite view, a constantly shifting representation of threats and opportunities. It was here that a key realization took root. Germany's dependence on radio to coordinate its wolfpacks was both its advantage and its weakness. Each U-boat that reported a sighting risked unmasking its general position. Each request for guidance, however brief, sent a thin line of radio energy across the ocean. Shore stations in Iceland, Newfoundland, Northern Ireland and the Western Isles captured these signals and passed their bearings to Liverpool. A single bearing was of limited use, but three or more, plotted together, could illuminate a gap in the enemy's screen or reveal the path of a shadowing submarine. The next stage was to bring this capability to sea. HFDF sets began appearing on escort vessels in increasing numbers from late 1941 onward. Unlike shore installations, shipborne HFDF had to contend with sea motion, vibration, and structural interference. Calibration was critical. Operators were trained to swing the loop aerial smoothly, aligning the null point with the incoming signal. In practice, the margin of error could be several degrees, but even that was enough to provide a direction of threat. An escort commander, receiving such a report, could turn to sweep the bearing with radar or ASDIC, or order the convoy to alter course. Additional tools strengthened the picture. Centimetric radar, operating at shorter wavelengths, arrived on some escorts by 1942, giving them the ability to detect surfaced U-boats even in poor visibility. Coastal Command aircraft, equipped with radar of their own, extended the reach of the defense, attacking or scattering U-boats before they could concentrate. And deep within Western Approach's headquarters, researchers analyzed the effectiveness of each new development, adjusting tactics with rare speed. Patterns emerged: the typical intervals of U-boat reporting, the distances wolfpacks preferred between boats, the times of night when attacks were most likely less visible. But equally important were the convoy codes themselves. The Admiralty maintained a complex set of routing instructions, diversion plans, and communication protocols for merchant traffic, all held in guarded codebooks aboard every convoy commodore's ship. On more than one occasion, The Germans had succeeded in obtaining partial information about convoy codes, whether through captures at sea or intelligence leaks. Each compromise prompted rapid change. By 1943, routing codes were stricter, renewal cycles were shorter, and commanders were alert to the risk of any pattern the enemy might exploit. For the men at sea, however, this intricate network remained mostly unseen. A wireless rating sat at his set, copying signals in groups of 5. A signalman on a merchant ship raised a flag hoist to pass an order visually down the line. A telegrapher's hammer tapped at a key in the dark. None of them saw the entire picture, yet each contributed to it. The war had become deeply technical, but its execution depended on human steadiness, on individuals performing small parts of an immense machine. Gradually, the balance began to shift. U-boat reports that once guided Wolfpacks with precision now invited counteraction. Convoys moved with greater confidence, rerouting around danger instead of blindly sailing into it. Escorts, armed with better sensors and faster communication, struck more quickly and more often, and the Admiralty, drawing on decrypted signals, HFDF bearings, air reconnaissance and surface reports, grew steadily more adept at predicting where Wolfpacks would form. By early 1943. The stage was set for a decisive test. A single convoy, crossing the mid-Atlantic at a moment when the U-boat arm reached its maximum strength, would reveal whether Britain's evolving web of intelligence, technology and human skill could withstand the concentrated force of a Wolfpack. The answer would come in the cold, gray days of spring. On a North Atlantic escort, the wireless rating lived at the intersection of noise and precision. His world was a cramped compartment lit by red bulbs to preserve night vision, the bulkheads lined with racks of glowing valves and the soft hum of transformers. Even in heavy weather, when the ship rolled so sharply that loose items slid across the deck, the wireless office had to remain composed. Signals could not wait for calmer seas. Training for these men was rigorous but unglamorous, learning frequencies, mastering Morse, handling cipher pads, and, increasingly, operating HFDF equipment. A great deal depended on consistency. A rushed logbook entry or a mistranscribed signal could distort the tactical picture far beyond his ship. Ratings were trained to listen through static for the briefest transmission, the clipped 20-second U-boat report that often preceded a coordinated attack. The sound was unmistakable once learned, a compressed burst, disciplined in rhythm, cutting sharply against the background hiss. When such a signal broke through the headphones, the rating moved quickly but without haste. Frequency noted, loop aerial swung, bearing taken from the meters, needle settling into its characteristic dip. The result was passed to the bridge in a short, structured code. No embellishment, no speculation, simply data. These acts seldom earned recognition. Escort logs recorded signals by time and bearing, not by the men who made them. Yet the accuracy of a single HFDF bearing could redirect an escort, disrupt a U-boat shadow, or prompt the convoy to alter course before danger fully formed. In the vast Atlantic, clarity came from the smallest gestures, the patient ear of a young sailor hunched over a set, shaping events far beyond his knowledge. At the head of every convoy sailed the Commodore's vessel, often an aging merchantman chosen not for its speed but for the experience of the officers aboard. The Commodore was typically a retired Royal Navy captain or an elderly merchant master recalled to service. His responsibility was immense, maintaining station discipline, ensuring orders were passed without confusion, and keeping 40 or more ships aligned across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The signal officers around him served as the convoy's nervous system. Wireless silence was the default. Radio transmissions risked revealing the convoy's position, so visual signals became an art form. Semaphore flags flickered in the wind by day. Aldis lamps flashed tight beams of light at night. Black shapes rose on the halyards to convey maneuvers. Every ship watched the Commodore's mast, passing orders down the columns with disciplined speed. Inside the Commodore's wireless room lay the confidential books, routing instructions, emergency maneuvers, and the code groups used to interpret Admiralty signals when radio silence had to be broken. The officers understood the stakes. A single compromised codebook, if captured, could expose entire convoy schedules. The Commodore's ship therefore maintained strict protocol. Safes locked, pages sealed, destruction charges ready if abandonment became necessary. What the Commodore rarely saw, but always sensed, was the unseen guidance behind certain signals from the escort commander. An abrupt course alteration, an unexpected diversion. These decisions often drew upon intelligence. He was never permitted to know HFDF bearings from distant escorts, decrypted traffic from Bletchley Park, or reports from aircraft hundreds of miles away. The Commodore acted on trust, aware that the safety of every ship behind him depended on the reliability of signals whose origins lay far beyond his bridge, far from the Atlantic storms. In the protected rooms of Western Approach's headquarters in Liverpool, the battle at sea unfolded on vast, brightly lit charts. Rows of Wrens and naval officers tracked convoys, escorts, and suspected U-boat positions with colored markers. Teleprinters rattled constantly. Reports from Coastal Command aircraft, HFDF stations, and escorts at sea arrived in uneven bursts, some detailed, others no more than a time, frequency, and bearing. The plotting rooms turned these fragments into coherent patterns. A bearing from a shore station in Northern Ireland, another from Iceland, and a third from a Canadian site could be triangulated to form a rough location of a transmitting U-boat. When multiple such bearings clustered, analysts suspected a Wolfpack forming. The atmosphere resembled a quiet, concentrated tension. No raised voices, only the shuffle of charts and the repeated checking of lines that could change the course of an entire convoy. Every decision carried weight. A misjudged plot could divert ships into danger. A delayed report might allow a Wolfpack to tighten its screen. Yet the staff worked with remarkable calm. They knew the ocean through abstractions, lines, grids, vectors, yet understood the human reality behind every marker. A convoy slowed by weather, an escort damaged in an earlier attack, a U-boat likely running low on fuel. From these rooms came the signals that shaped the Atlantic War: route adjustments, support group deployments, and urgent warnings to escort commanders. But the origins of many critical inputs, a single U-boat transmission caught by a wireless rating in heavy seas, were almost invisible in the final plot. Still, each bearing mattered. Each line on the map could alter the fate of dozens of ships. For the U-boat crews, the Atlantic War was defined by isolation. Their boats operated hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly shore, often submerged for long periods, relying on short radio bursts to maintain contact with headquarters. Admiral Karl Dönitz, directing operations from his headquarters in France, depended on this network. He arranged U-boats into long patrol lines, often dozens of miles apart, in the hope that one would sight a convoy. Once contact was made, the boat sent a brief encrypted message. The content was minimal: estimated convoy position, course, and speed. These reports were essential. Without them, the Wolfpack concept could not function. Yet each transmission, however short, carried risk. German discipline required operators to compress messages into the narrowest possible window, using high-frequency bands that traveled great distances. A U-boat captain knew he must surface to send his signal, trusting his lookouts to keep watch for aircraft. When Enigma keys remained secure, German command enjoyed considerable confidence. Dönitz received a steady flow of contact reports and could direct boats with near real-time accuracy. Orders moved back across the ether. Instructions to close the convoy's predicted track, to attack at night on the surface, or to maintain shadowing while reinforcements arrived. But the system had vulnerabilities. Each signal, though encrypted, revealed a bearing to Allied HFDF stations. The more U-boats involved, the more transmissions required. What made the Wolfpack strong also exposed it. As 1943 approached, Dönitz faced an enemy who was learning to interpret silence as carefully as sound, and who increasingly used those momentary transmissions to strike first. The bridge of a Mid-Ocean escort in 1943 was a compact theater of instruments, personnel, and procedure. The captain stood at the center, flanked by the officer of the watch, the quartermaster at the wheel, and signalmen ready at lamps or flags. Radar screens glowed in the darkness. Operators hunched over them as the ship pitched and rolled. Aztec operators below sent updates on contacts ahead, their voices relayed through speaking tubes or telephone circuits. HFDF information entered this environment with deliberate simplicity. A message came up from the wireless office, a bearing, identified as a probable U-boat transmission. The captain weighed it against the radar picture, the latest intelligence from western approaches, and the convoy's formation. Decisions had to be swift. A bearing 20 degrees off the starboard bow might indicate a shadowing submarine. A sudden cluster of bearings could mean a Wolfpack forming. Escort commanders developed a style of leadership suited to this blend of intuition and data. Some preferred aggressive maneuvers, turning hard to sweep a bearing line. Others favored caution, maintaining station and relaying the information to neighboring ships. When radar confirmed a suspicious contact, the ship might accelerate, engine straining, to force the enemy to dive or break off shadowing. The technology was imperfect. Bearings could be imprecise, radar returns fleeting, ASDIC echoes ambiguous. Yet the cumulative effect of these tools, and the officers who understood their strengths and limits, gave escorts a sharper edge than ever before. Each new signal extended their reach, allowing them to challenge U-boats before they reached firing position. The bridge became not only a place of command, but a focal point of the growing convergence between human judgment and technical insight. For merchant seamen, the war of signals remained largely abstract. Their experience was defined by labor, weather, and routine. They felt the Atlantic through the vibration of engines, the sting of salt spray, and the long monotony of watches kept in cold winds. Most knew little about HFDF, Bletchley Park, or radar systems evolving around them. What they understood were the visible signs: sudden course changes, escorts altering speed, aircraft appearing unexpectedly overhead. Rumors traveled quickly on deck. A change of direction might prompt speculation that the convoy was avoiding a wolf. A distant explosion muffled by wind could mean an escort attacking a contact. The men seldom received explanations. They relied on the steady signals passed down from the Commodore's mast and the escort commander's movements along the flanks. Merchant sailors faced constant danger. Their ships carried vital cargo: grain, ammunition, petrol, machinery. Many were elderly, with limited speed and fragile structure. A torpedo strike left little time to react. Lifeboat drills were routine, and seamen memorized escape routes in darkness. Yet morale often rested on confidence in the escorts, small, determined ships whose crews fought unseen battles on behalf of every merchantman. From a merchant deck, signals appeared as flashes of light, hoisted shapes, or faint tones from a radio man under strict orders. But behind each signal lay a chain of decisions shaped by intelligence they would never read, bearings they would never see, and wireless operators they would never meet. The sailors knew only the outcome: whether the convoy held together, whether the escorts kept the shadows at bay, and whether another dawn arrived with all ships still in company. By late April 1943, convoy Outsmarted assembled off the coast of Britain under grey skies and a rising swell. It consisted of more than 40 merchant ships, many of them aging tramp steamers loaded with ballast or essential goods, returning to North America. Escort Group B7, a mixture of destroyers, sloops and corvettes, formed its protective ring. Among them sailed HMS AFA, HMS Oribe, HMS Vedette, and several sturdy Flower-class corvettes whose crews knew the mid-Atlantic as intimately as their own mess. These ships had fought through some of the hardest months of the Atlantic War. Their officers carried the quiet weight of past battles. Their ratings had learned discipline under conditions few ashore could imagine. Weather began to shape the convoy from the outset. A deep low-pressure system swept in from the Labrador Sea, bringing harsh winds, steep waves, and visibility that shrank to a few hundred yards. For the merchantman, maintaining station became a test of endurance. For the escorts, the storm offered both risk and opportunity. U-boats struggled to maintain contact in heavy seas. Radar performance varied. ASDIC was disrupted by turbulence. Yet the same conditions could scatter wolfpacks or disrupt attack coordination. The convoy pressed onward, the cold driving ice onto the escort's superstructures, the bows smashing into the swell with rhythmic violence. Unbeknown to the merchant captains and most of their crews, German headquarters had begun assembling an ambitious and several U-boat groups, bearing names such as Star and Fink, had been repositioned to intercept westbound convoys. At the point where Allied air cover faltered, Outsmarted was heading directly into this region. As it advanced, Bletchley Park decrypts indicated growing U-boat activity along its projected path. At the same time, HFDF stations ashore began to register increased transmissions from the mid. Lines drawn from Northern Ireland, Iceland and Newfoundland converged into areas where wolfpacks were likely concentrating. These signals were passed at Western Approaches Command, where analysts began plotting a picture of imminent danger. A message went to the escort commander: maintain vigilance, expect contact. At sea, however, much of this intelligence could only be inferred. The escort's captains studied their bearings, radar scopes, and the behavior of the ocean itself, searching for any sign of a shadowing submarine. The convoy's routines tightened. Signalmen kept watch on all directions. Wireless offices remained fully manned. Then came the first hint. Late one night, during a brief lull in the storm, a U-boat sent a short contact report. The transmission, though encrypted, was instantly recognizable. An escort's HFDF operator noted the bearing, logging it to the second. Nearby escorts picked up the same signal, adding their own bearing lines. Within minutes, the escort commander estimated that at least one submarine was astern of the convoy, likely shadowing at low speed. The escorts turned to challenge. HMS Vedette, an experienced sloop, accelerated to investigate the bearing. Her radar probed the darkness, but heavy seas made interpretation difficult. The ship pressed on, engines vibrating, the bow punching into the swells as lookouts strained for any sign. A plume of exhaust, a silhouette against the sky, the faint gleam of water running off a submarine's casing. The U-boat slipped away, but not far. A second transmission came shortly afterward, caught by another escort's HFDF set. Its bearing suggested the same submarine continuing to shadow. This was a known tactic. A U-boat would keep visual contact and report convoy movements until reinforcements could converge. The escorts responded with renewed determination, their search patterns widening. The convoy altered course discreetly, following a prearranged maneuver designed to dislocate a shadowing boat's predicted track. For several hours, the weather worsened again, masking movements on both sides. Yet the HFDF bearings continued intermittently, and patterns began to emerge. U-boat signals appeared not singly but in clusters, each suggesting another submarine edging into position. Escort commanders understood the implication the Wolfpack was forming. As the convoy crossed deeper into the mid-Atlantic gap, the distances involved grew larger. Aircraft from Iceland and Newfoundland were too far to provide consistent cover. The escorts shouldered the burden alone. Their bridge teams maintained intense focus, checking radar continuously. Wireless operators monitored frequencies used by U-boats for shadowing reports, and whenever a bearing came through, sharp, brief, uncertain, It fed the escort's next movement. Gradually, the tension aboard the convoy hardened into expectation. Officers of the watch saw it in the way captains leaned forward at each HFDF signal. Ratings felt it in the small adjustments made to readiness. Ammunition boxes opened on deck. Depth charges set to variable patterns. Lamps covered. Voice pipes tested. The ocean around them felt vast and dark, yet somehow crowded with unseen threats. Still, the escorts pushed outward, challenging the bearings, forcing submerged dives wherever possible, and making the Wolfpack struggle to maintain contact. The storm that battered the convoy hindered the U-boats too. Communication between them was erratic, and all the while, each tiny fragment of information gathered, each bearing logged by a wireless rating on a pitching escort, shaped the decisions taken on the bridge and the wider tactical view forming at Western Approach's headquarters. The convoy's fate hung not on a single dramatic moment, but on a slow accumulation of signals that turned a vast ocean into an intelligible, if deadly, landscape. Ahead lay the most intense phase of the battle, when the Wolfpack would strike in force. By the evening of the 4th of May 1943, the storm that had shielded ONS 5 began to ease. The sea settled into a long heavy swell, and the wind dropped enough for lookouts to see a few ship lengths ahead. For the U-boats, this was the opening they had been waiting for. After days of difficult conditions, more than a dozen submarines had converged on the convoy's vicinity. Their reports, though brief, had accumulated into a cluster of HFDF bearings that told the escorts one clear truth. The Wolfpack was now close. The first blow fell after dusk. A merchant ship toward the rear of the convoy was hit by a torpedo fired in a textbook surface attack. The U-boat using the twilight to mask its approach. A column of flame rose from the ship's stern, followed by the low boom of munitions igniting deep below. Signal lamps flashed across the convoy. Escorts responded at once. HMS Lochalsh and a pair of corvettes detached, racing towards the stricken vessel. Their Aztec operators dropped charges in a widening pattern, the underwater explosions thudding through the hulls of nearby ships. A second merchantman was struck soon after. This time the attackers were detected. Radar aboard HMS Vedette registered a suspicious contact moving swiftly on the surface. Vedette turned hard to intercept, engines pounding as she surged through the swell. The radar echo wavered, disappeared, then reappeared. The captain ordered starshells fired. Brilliant white flares burst overhead, illuminating the sea in harsh light. For a moment, the outline of a U-boat was visible, conning tower low, crew scrambling to dive. Vedette attacked without hesitation. Her depth charge rails clattered as charges rolled into the sea. Moments later, plumes of water erupted as the ship's Aztec operators listened intently. A faint, metallic reverberation followed, a sign that the U-boats had been forced deep and damaged. Though not confirmed, sunk, the submarine withdrew, unable to continue shadowing. Elsewhere, HMS Oribe executed a similar interception. A radar contact at close range hinted at a U-boat attempting to penetrate the convoy's edge. Oribe accelerated, closing the gap. Her lookouts spotted a dark shape cutting through the surface. The ship rammed. The impact jarred every man aboard. The U-boat rolled violently and slid under, leaving only broken planking and oil on the water. Oribe herself sustained damage but remained operational. The U-boat was later assessed as destroyed. These sharp, aggressive actions unsettled the Wolfpack. For years, E-boats had exploited the night, running on the surface to position themselves for torpedo attacks. Now they found themselves hunted in the very conditions that had once favored them. Centimetric radar, a technology the Germans had not yet fully countered, stripped away their invisibility. HFDF bearings exposed their attempts to communicate. The familiar rhythm of attack, report and regroup faltered. Still, the battle intensified. At the height of the engagement, escorts detected multiple submarines around the convoy. HMS Loosestrife forced one U-boat deep with well-placed depth charges, later recovering survivors, a rare occurrence in such waters. HMS Pelican, operating slightly ahead of the main convoy, made contact with another submarine and sank it after a sustained pursuit. Each success cost time and fuel, yet denied the Wolfpack vital numbers. For the merchant crews, the night became a blur of signals and fear. Orders to alter course flashed across the columns. Ships heaved in close formation, their engines straining to maintain alignment. Lookouts stared into darkness, knowing that a torpedo's wake might be visible only at the last moment. When a vessel was struck, those on nearby decks felt the shock reverberate through the water. Yet discipline held. The convoy did not scatter. What shaped this night more than luck, more than weather, was the unseen accumulation of signals. Each HFDF bearing taken by an escort, each fragment of traffic intercepted ashore, each radar contact cross-referenced with intelligence from Western approaches, gradually eroded the Wolfpack's cohesion. Escorts attacked, not blindly but with informed intent, turning towards the most likely threats, forcing submarines to dive prematurely, denying them the ability to fire effectively. By the early hours of the 6th of May, the tide of battle had turned decisively. The Wolfpack had lost several submarines. Others were damaged or low on torpedoes. Supplies were dwindling, morale slipping. Communications between the boats became increasingly sporadic as Allied attacks disrupted their attempts to coordinate. A final series of U-boat transmissions, brief, hurried, and increasingly erratic, were picked up on HFDF bearings that showed the Wolfpack breaking apart. ONS 5 continued westward. Its escorts, hardened by years of Atlantic warfare, maintained constant readiness, but the intensity of U-boat attacks faded. Radar detected no further surface contacts. ASDIC sweeps yielded nothing beyond the usual echoes of deep ocean layers. Even the weather shifted, granting the convoy a rare period of relative calm. When the final reports reached Dinitz's headquarters, the reaction was immediate and grave. Of the boats committed to the attack, several had been lost, others damaged, still more forced to withdraw. The number of torpedo hits on the convoy did not justify the cost. ONS 5 had suffered losses, but not at the scale expected of such a determined Wolfpack assault. German analysts concluded that Allied defenses had improved dramatically and that the U-boat arm was now facing an enemy who could anticipate maneuvers before they fully formed. Something fundamental had changed, and at the center of that change were signals, the concise report from a wireless rating, the careful plotting in Liverpool, the radar pulse catching a U-boat unawares, each action small, almost anonymous, together, decisive. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point when ONS 5 finally cleared the main hunting grounds. The immediate feeling aboard its surviving ships was less triumph than exhaustion. The convoy had lost merchant vessels, men, cargo, and steel consigned to the depths, and those losses were felt keenly in mess decks and wardrooms alike. Survivors picked up from rafts and open boats arrived aboard escorts, shivering, oil-stained, and silent. The routine of blankets, hot tea, and spare clothing was performed with practiced efficiency. No one needed to be told what they had escaped. On paper, the figures told a complicated story. ONS 5 had suffered a notable number of sinkings and damaged ships, yet against that stood an unprecedented tally of U-boats destroyed or driven off. For the first time in the Atlantic War, a major convoy battle had resulted in losses that weighed more heavily on the attackers than on the defenders. The Admiralty, reviewing the reports, noted this inversion with quiet satisfaction and characteristic caution. No one in Whitehall believed the U-boat threat had vanished, but something important had shifted. In Western Approach's headquarters, the battle was reconstructed in meticulous detail. Signals, HFDF bearings, radar plots, and escort reports were laid out chronologically. Operational researchers examined the sequence of events when U-boat transmissions were first detected, how quickly bearings were taken, how escorts reacted, which tactics had forced submarines to break off attacks. They studied not only successes but failures, torpedoes that found their mark, gaps in the screen, instances where a contact had been misinterpreted or not acted upon quickly enough. From this analysis came a series of practical conclusions. First, that shipborne HFDF, when handled by well-trained operators and integrated properly into escort tactics, had become a weapon in its own right. Bearings taken at sea, combined with shore-based direction finding and decryption intelligence, allowed commanders to anticipate Wolfpack movements rather than simply react to them. Second, that centimetric radar had fundamentally altered night fighting. U-boats could no longer assume that darkness and rough seas would conceal them as they closed to attack positions on the surface. Third, and perhaps most telling, was the role of discipline. Convoy ONS 5 had held formation under ferocious conditions. Escorts had resisted the instinct to chase individual submarines too far from their charges. Merchant ships, even when hit, had not caused the convoy to scatter in panic, a reflex that had proved deadly in earlier years. The machinery of defense had worked not because it was technically flawless, but because ships and men had applied procedure under pressure. These lessons were not confined to post-action reports. They began to inform immediate practice. Escort groups shared their experiences. Training establishments incorporated new case studies. Western Approaches circulated guidance refining how HFDF bearings should be reported and exploited. There was an increasing emphasis on rapid, standardized formats for signals. On the German side, the consequences were even more stark. When Dönitz and his staff assessed the results of the ONS 5 engagement, they saw a pattern replicated across other convoys that spring. The cost in submarines was rising sharply, while sinkings of Allied shipping were no longer keeping pace. Boats sent into the North Atlantic were encountering escorts that seemed forewarned, striking with a confidence that suggested prior knowledge of Wolfpack dispositions. Messages from U-boat commanders reported increasing difficulty in maintaining contact, surprise attacks from radar-equipped escorts, and growing concern at the effectiveness of Allied air patrols at the fringes of the convoy routes. By May 1943, the cumulative effect of these changes produced what later historians would call Black May for the U-boat arm. Losses mounted to levels the German command could not sustain. Dönitz faced a grim arithmetic. Experienced crews were becoming casualties faster than they could be replaced. New boats, though still coming off the slips, required months of training before they could fight effectively. The decision was taken to withdraw many submarines from the North Atlantic, reassessing tactics and equipment in the face of a transformed enemy. Yet for those who had sailed with ONS 5, the strategic labels applied later would have meant little. What they knew was that they had run a gauntlet and survived barely, and at cost. Escort men understood instinctively that their tools had made the difference. The radar set that caught a U-boat on the surface, the HFDF bearing that guided a nighttime sweep, the discipline that held the screen together in heavy weather. Behind the official communiques and carefully worded Admiralty statements lay another truth, that, in the struggle between Wolfpack and convoy, the power of a single well-handled signal had now been fully realized, and the implications of that realization reached far beyond a single convoy battle. As spring moved into summer 1943, the wider consequences of the ONS 5 battle became increasingly visible. The Atlantic War, long balanced on a knife edge, began to tilt. For years, the U-boat arm had forced Britain into a perpetual state of vigilance, its threat shaping strategy, industry and daily life. Now, for the first time, the strategic initiative was shifting, not decisively, not yet securely, but unmistakably. Convoy losses declined sharply. Merchant ships began to reach British ports in greater numbers, their cargoes of wheat, fuel, machinery and military stores flowing into a national economy strained by 4 years of total war. Dockside reports from Liverpool, Glasgow and Belfast noted the improvement with cautious optimism. The Admiralty refrained from any public declaration of victory. Memories of earlier reversals were too fresh, and Enigma intelligence remained far too sensitive. But internal memoranda preserved at Kew reveal a quiet, growing confidence. The balance is altered, one post-action summary observed, and may now be maintained in our favor. Several factors drove this change. One was the cumulative improvement in technology, where radar sets became more reliable, more numerous, and increasingly resistant to countermeasures. HFDF installations multiplied across escorts, giving each group a networked sense of the enemy's movements. Air cover extended further into the mid-ocean gap as long-range aircraft arrived in greater numbers. Anti-submarine weapons, from improved depth charges to head-throwing mortars, were refined. But technology alone did not define the shift. It was the integration, the quiet, persistent stitching together of intelligence, signals, training and procedure that gave the Allies a decisive edge. The work of Bletchley Park, though unknown to most who sailed, provided a strategic map of the wider battle. Western Approach's headquarters interpreted that map, adjusting routes and timetables for maximum safety. Escort commanders applied those insights at sea, and wireless ratings, HFDF operators, radar teams and lookouts each contributed fragments of information that, combined, shaped the convoy's defense. Another factor was the maturing of escort groups themselves. By 1943, many Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy crews had survived multiple Atlantic crossings. They had learned which signals mattered, which echoes to trust, how to maneuver aggressively without losing cohesion, and how to interpret the behavior of shadowing U-boats. Their experience complemented the growing technical sophistication of the Allied system. Training manuals changed, but so did instincts. An escort commander could now act with confidence on a single HFDF bearing, or a fleeting radar return because he had seen such fragments lead to successful engagements before. German commanders recognized these trends with growing alarm. Messages intercepted and later decoded reveal increasing frustration in U-boat reports, complaints about radar detection, difficulties maintaining contact in the face of unexpected convoy maneuvers, and the unnerving accuracy with which escorts seemed to find them. Dunnett and his staff sought answers, improved radar detectors, different patrol patterns, new operational doctrines, but the core difficulty persisted. The Wolfpack system, once so effective, had become predictable. U-boat transmissions, though brief, were no longer swallowed by the Atlantic's vastness. They were mapped, interpreted, and used against their senders. Meanwhile, the human cost of the long campaign remained stark. The merchant navy suffered grievous losses throughout the war, and even in 1943, sailors continued to face the daily possibility of sudden death. Escorts, too, remained vulnerable. A single torpedo could end a ship and her crew in moments. An aircraft, vital to the anti-submarine battle, conducted long missions over cold seas where mechanical failure or weather could be as lethal as any enemy. The improvement in results did not lessen the danger for those who served. It simply offered a better chance of survival. Yet amid the scale of the Atlantic War, its factories, codes, command centers, and fleets, the individual contribution remained essential. The wireless rating who caught a brief U-boat transmission, the HFDF operator who drew a steady line on a plotting sheet, the radar operator who spotted a faint return that others might have dismissed. Their names rarely appear in dispatches. Their actions are recorded as timestamps and bearings in logs stored quietly in archival boxes. But their work reshaped the battle. Layer by layer, signal by signal, they helped build the system that blunted the Wolfpacks and kept Britain supplied. In the months that followed ONS 5, this system would continue to evolve, tightening its grip on the Atlantic until the U-arm once the gravest threat to Britain's survival found itself increasingly hunted, increasingly isolated, and increasingly unable to dictate the terms of the war at sea. The greatest battles are often remembered through the actions of commanders, yet here, the turning point lay in thousands of precise, disciplined acts performed by individuals who asked for no notice and received little. It was quiet, persistent courage, the kind that seldom makes headlines, that carried the Atlantic into a new phase. In the great sweep of the Second World War, certain victories stand illuminated: El Alamein, Normandy, the liberation of Europe. Others unfold quietly, without banners or proclamations, carried by men whose names seldom appear in the histories. The turning of the Atlantic in 1943 was one of these. Lacked spectacle. There were no grand maneuvers, no dramatic photographs of triumph. Instead, it was shaped by signals: the brief pulse of a transmitter, the angle of a needle on a HFD set, the measured tone of a rating reporting a bearing in the middle of a storm. Modern war, the Admiralty understood, depended increasingly on the invisible, on information, interpretation, and the ability to transform fragments into understanding. The battle between convoy and Wolfpack became, in essence, a contest of invisible lines, radio waves, radar pulses, plotted bearings, and coded instructions. Against this backdrop, the courage required was not always the courage of assault, but the quieter steadiness of those who kept watch, made calculations, and held to procedure even as explosions echoed in the darkness around them. The unnamed, wireless rating in our opening scene represents thousands of such individuals. He was not a hero in the traditional mold. He did not fire torpedoes, command escorts, or shape high strategy. Yet his work and the work of men and women like him altered the rhythm of the Atlantic War. Each signal he caught, each bearing he logged, each message he passed helped weave a defensive net that eventually outmatched the Wolfpacks that had threatened Britain's survival. Their contribution endures today in places far from the ocean, in the quiet rooms of the National Archives at Kew, where bundles of logbooks record the timings and bearings upon which whole convoys depended; in the galleries of the Imperial War, a museum where a single set of headphones or a steel direction-finding loop reflects the discipline of a generation. The Atlantic is peaceful now. Its vastness hides the traces of those struggles, but the legacy remains a reminder that the fate of nations can hinge on the discipline of individuals, performing their duty unseen, shaping history one signal at a time.